Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I think we've been on about a 9-month hiatus or something like that. My wife and I welcomed our first child into the world about 7 months ago. And since then, between fatherhood and doing workshops, teaching, we just finished a little bit of a lecture tour up the East Coast into New York and into Canada. I've just been very busy, a little too busy to get to the channel. And so I'm hoping now to get back into the swing of things here. And I thought it'd be interesting this week and for the next video, which hopefully will be next week or the week after, to look at kind of compare and contrast two different views of virtue. And so this week I wanted to look at kind of more traditional virtue, the way it's understood in many societies that have been influenced by Christianity, Islam, Judaism, because all of their views of virtue to an extent were influenced by Platonism. And so I thought it'd be interesting to look at the Platonic view of virtue this week, which is kind of, we could say, a more traditional view of sainthood and righteousness, courage and wisdom, and the things that we often associate with virtue. And then with the next video, probably next week, contrast that with some of the concepts of what's called crazy wisdom, right? This sense of very taboo activity amongst the saints. And so this week we'll be looking at the kind of classic concepts of virtue and sainthood and righteousness, whereas with the next video we'll be looking at some of the more bizarre stories of different saints and bizarre behavior, some of the taboo behavior that's even expected in some different traditions, or at least there's a place in some traditions for that behavior. Now, when we're trying to understand virtue in the Platonic traditions, which influenced a lot of the Greco-Roman world, and then from their influence, much of the world today, when we look at the concepts of virtue in Platonism, we see that they evolved a lot over the course of the years. They went through a lot of different changes throughout the 1,000 years that Platonism was functioning as a serious philosophic school in the Mediterranean. Despite the way that the concepts of virtue changed and developed, there remain certain central themes at the core of it. So the first is assimilation to deity, that virtue is how the perfection of the human being is achieved, and this perfection is some degree of assimilation to the divine or to the good or to the one, depending on who's talking. So if we look at Plato or some of especially the Middle Platonists who focus a lot on ethics and virtue, like Plutarch, for example, in his Moralia, we see concepts of virtue where a divine person is a good person, right? And a good person is someone who lives a virtuous, ethical life to the best of their ability. And understanding that within the worldview of Platonism, wisdom and knowledge are part of virtue. So it doesn't just mean that they're necessarily acting in a good way or that they behave well in certain situations. It means that there's an intellectual process, an intelligible process happening as well within the person that is considered to be virtuous. When we move into later traditions, especially we start getting very mystical, like with Plotinus, then when Plotinus speaks about virtue, he's now talking something more akin to the ideas of things that lead to self-realization, things that lead to a kind of total union, even an ecstatic or meditative union with the divine. And then if we go a little past Plotinus into Iamblichus, who will look at some of his concepts today as well, then we start dealing with concepts of virtue that become very esoteric, very tantric or magical, so to say, and a definition of what the perfect human being is that in a sense has now gone beyond some of what maybe Plato originally implied and has become more encompassing of a lot of the different wisdom traditions that were active in the Mediterranean. So depending kind of where we look in the history of Platonism, we get a bit of a different definition as to what the perfect human life is, but there's an agreement that virtue and a virtuous life is what elevates you to the perfect human life. A second common theme in Platonism is that virtue is the means to living a fulfilling life. So regardless of any sense of self-realization or self-actualization or the transcendence of the soul beyond the mundane world, there's the sense that virtue leads to also a perfectly happy, or at least the greatest degree of happiness possible within mundane life. And again, this will look a little differently depending on who you ask or where you are in the Platonic timeline. Because for someone like Plotinus or Porphyry, you might have a definition of happiness that looks very much like kind of a renunciant yogi, who's totally happy and content without anything. Whereas if you look more like with Plato, and especially with Aristotle, right after Plato, you have a definition of happiness that's a little bit more, I feel, realistic for the household or for a common person, a definition of happiness that involves things like money and family and physical health and strength and well-being. And this ends up being echoed also by the later Platonists, people such as Iamblichus and Proclus Syrianus, where their view of virtue and of happiness, of the happy life, encompasses mystical fulfillment and spiritual fulfillment, but also worldly fulfillment. Right? Many of the later Platonists were quite well-to-do financially and had families and, were important parts in their community. Proclus was, for example, an incredibly important part of his community, always entertaining different political guests and was very influential in his community, not just with politics, but even in the raising of children. I think Marinus mentions he was the godfather of some 40 or 50 kids in Athens, something of the sort. So in later Platonism, we see also this very encompassing view of happiness, that you don't have to renounce the world necessarily to be a virtuous person. Virtue is compatible with the world, that there can be a virtuous way to relate with the world, which is one of the things that I feel resonates really profoundly with Platonism for modern spiritual practitioners who are trying to find this balance, because many of the teachings that come from India and China, from the Buddhist traditions, from the yogic traditions, often kind of neglect the world. And that's not very relatable to a lot of common and modern practitioners, whereas the Platonic view, and especially the later Platonic view, allows for the deepest mystical and metaphysical fulfillments possible for a human being without necessarily having to reject the world. So the concept of virtue within Platonism and how it relates to happiness, again, there's this consensus that Platonic virtue leads to not only the greatest fulfillment mystically, but also the greatest temporal fulfillment of total happiness and bliss and well-being within the world. And that doesn't mean there won't be hardship in your life. It means that you will be able to experience the hardship in your life in a positive way and have a healthy relationship to hardship in your life, so that that hardship doesn't become unnecessary suffering. The later Platonists had refined and expanded upon the concept of virtue from early Platonism and Middle Platonism into a scheme of kind of 7 agreed upon levels of virtue, almost like somewhat similar to the Sufi concept of the stations that the soul moves through. Likewise, in your path towards perfection, towards spiritual attainment, your soul would have to move through these 7 degrees of virtue. And there's a little bit of discrepancy or disagreement as to whether or not the realized being should have all 7 of these levels within them at once, or if you move through them and kind of left the earlier ones behind. Plotinus, for example, feels that you should never leave the earlier ones behind. But at the same time, Plotinus, Porphyry, and Iamblichus would have given more weight to what were considered higher degrees of virtue, the more metaphysical and mystical degrees of virtue, as opposed to the more common and mundane levels of virtue. So the first level of virtue is what was called the physica arete, the physical virtue. And the word there, arete, is very interesting in Greek, because arete is somewhat similar to the Sanskrit word siddhi, which means perfection. So when we use the word virtue, and we understand the way that the Greeks use the word arete, it's a little different than maybe in English the way we would use the word ethical or virtuous, because in Greek it conveys this concept a little bit of something which elevates you, something which takes you towards perfection, or even itself a kind of perfecting trait. So the physica arete, the physical virtues, were, what we would expect. They were good health, mobility, strength, range of motion, healthy inwardly, healthy outwardly, right? And this is actually something that modern society, at least here in the U.S. and in a lot of developed countries, modern society has pretty well down, right? There's been a huge fitness revolution. There's a lot of people who diet, a lot of people who exercise. All the gyms are full. And so fusicarete is definitely something that was very important to old Greek and Roman cultures and has become very important to a lot of different modern cultures as well. Um, Plato never taught in the concept of a weak mystic or philosopher. He one of the things that was known when people would come to learn from him is you had to do wrestling exercises in the mornings, and there are some contemporaries of Plato who talk about seeing the disciples of Plato wrestling in the public park that he taught in as part of their morning drills and warm-ups. He lamented the idea that somebody should grow old and never know the fruits of physical health and physical endurance and what their body was capable of. And part of this was just his culture. In Greek culture, physical exercise and health and diet had been developed to a very high level, and it had become a very common thing. So it was looked down on a little bit to not take care of your body. So some of the more ascetic and renunciation inclined aspects of later Platonism, especially when we look at Plotinus and Porphyry, for example, Plato probably wouldn't have been a huge fan of. Plotinus was said to have had pretty poor physical hygiene, didn't eat too much, didn't wear the very good clothing, lived kind of like a renunciant yogi or sannyasi. And early Platonism is somewhat even directly opposed to that idea. So there's this, and this was taken up by Iamblichus and Proclus later on. There was a return to this idea after Plotinus that the physical body is a part of you. The physical body needs to be taken care of. So fusicarete, all the virtues in a sense are about kind of control and moderation and how you show respect to things. So if you respect the physical body, you treat it well and you make sure it has good range of movement, that it has good strength, that it will live good long life, and that its diet is good. And so this becomes kind of the ground level of the virtues in the Platonic tradition. The second level of virtue is really what we would just call etiquette in English, right? This sense of how do you relate to the people around you? Or how do you meet strangers? How do you relate to your parents? How do you relate to your children? How do you relate to siblings and cousins and family? How do you relate with your neighbors and your community? What's your relationship to them? And how do you conduct yourself around them? Do you treat them with respect? Etiquette is about treating people, even total strangers, with respect, because when you treat people with respect, it means that you understand they have a value. And etiquette is about appreciating and understanding the value of everything around you, not just people, but even objects. Do you have proper respect for your environment? Do you have proper respect for nature? Do you have proper respect for the oceans, for the rivers, for the trees and the plants? Do you have proper respect for your own possessions and treat them properly instead of neglecting them? Do you have respect for your husband, for your wife, for your parents, right? For your partner? These are really important things in many of the old world spiritual traditions. And in some, kind of later in a lot of those traditions, when a spirit of renunciation began to arise, it became somewhat allowable to treat these things with contempt. But in many of the old traditions, the Egyptian traditions, the Persian traditions, Syrian traditions, a lot of the Mediterranean traditions, there wasn't a whole lot of that going on. There was always a profound respect for things. And so this is the second level of virtue, is just etiquette. How do you behave? The third level of virtue is one which Plato himself deals with a lot in the dialogues, and it's called politica arete. Sometimes you translate it directly as political virtues, but it's a little better to call it like civic virtues, because it's about how do you relate with your community, right? What is your relationship to your community, to your country, to your state? And put simply, are you a good citizen? And to understand that to be a good citizen and to be a good member of your community doesn't necessarily mean that you follow blindly the corrupt laws or dictations of the country that you're in. But it does mean that you are a law-abiding citizen to the best of your ability, and especially that you abide by the laws that are meant to protect the people around you, meant to protect the citizenry, that you do your best. You don't just go blowing through red lights and stop signs and stuff in neighborhoods where children are playing, because you know that you won't be able to stop your vehicle with enough control and you might end up hurting somebody. You don't engage in theft. You just be a good citizen. You try to help your neighbor with things. You try to play a role in your community. You try to do charitable work, right? These are the civic virtues. The civic virtues, what happens as we move through all these virtues is we begin with a very small view of the self, right? The physical body, which is the physicality. Then we get a bit of a larger view of the self, yourself in relationship to your immediate family. This is etiquette. Then, as we go beyond that, we start getting an even larger view of the self, yourself in relationship to your community, to your state, to the people around you. And so, to be a good citizen from this perspective is doesn't necessarily mean that you follow every law perfectly or something. It means that you follow the good laws, and that as best as you can, you try to make sure that your community is better because of you, not worse because of you, right? That the people in your community benefit from you and from your presence in that community. So this is, put very simply, politica reti, the political virtues. Then, from Plotinus's view, you should kind of have these down, right? Like, you should be a decent person, is more or less what these mean. You should be treat your body with some respect, treat people around you and objects around you with respect, and be a good member of your community. And if you don't even have the self-control to do these things, then the higher virtues are probably going to be out of reach for you. So, to Plotinus, at least, it becomes important to have this working foundation. I think a lot of the Platonists would have had this view as well, though Plotinus mentions it explicitly in his Enneads. Once this these first three levels have been established, then we start to move kind of beyond the mundane realm. So we can say that these first three levels of virtue, the physical virtues, etiquette, and civic virtues, that these three are what we can call kind of the mundane virtues. And they deal with our relationship to the mundane world and to kind of regular household life. The next virtues we can call the philosophic virtues. These are virtues that are more about mysticism and the metaphysical and mystical ascent of the soul to begin with, as opposed to your relationship to the mundane world. And this is where philosophy is really meant to take you. So the first of these, and these two, the names for these come from Porphyry, the disciple of Plotinus. The first of these called the Kathartic Virtues, or the purificatory virtues. Plotinus mentions the Kathartic Virtues by name in the Enneads. These are virtues which are meant to purify you. Catharsis means purification. Well, purify you from what? Purify you from the kind of unwholesome association with your physical body and your physical identity that you have. So here we start to get almost some Vedantic concepts, some Indian concepts, some Buddhist concepts starting to come in. Whether they were direct influences from those cultures or they were Plotinus' own revelations, it's hard to tell. But there's room for this within Platonism, right? Like, there are multiple times even in the dialogues where Plato speaks about philosophy as a path of purification from bodily association into divine association. So, continuing on this theme, Plotinus calls these the Kathartic Virtues. This is the ability of the philosopher to contemplate and turn inwards and to tell themselves no, to prevent themselves from associating too deeply with worldly and material things, and their ability to turn inward. So we can almost say that these are somewhat yogic virtues in a way, things like fasting and different austerities, self-control, the ability to meditate or contemplate for very prolonged periods of time. For example, Socrates would often stand in one place and contemplate throughout the night, according to the testimony given about him in the Symposium. Plotinus was known to do the same thing, to basically go into a kind of samadhi or yogic trance for long periods of time. I believe Porphyry witnesses that, or mentions in his introduction to the Enneads, that he had witnessed this himself. He had witnessed Plotinus do this on 3 different occasions. So these are this kind of what the Kathartic virtues are. There's this dissociation from the physical body, the ability to moderate your relationship with the physical body so that you no longer delude yourself into thinking that you are confined by this physical body, that your identity is seated in the physical body. Instead, the Kathartic virtues are about recognizing yourself to be a soul. And so they do a lot with concepts of what we call like self-realization or to know thyself, which is a theme in the Alcibiades, for example, one of the dialogues of Plato. Constantly returning to this theme of who am I, what am I really? Am I this physical body, or does the physical body belong to me, right? Do I belong to the body? Does the body belong to me? And how we solve this riddle. This is what a lot of the Kathartic virtues are about. From the Kathartic virtues, we move to what Porphyry called the theoretic or the contemplative virtues, theoretica arete. So contemplative virtues, if we look at it from the perspective of Platonism, there's really only one thing that you're contemplating, which is the intelligible reality, okay, the noetic realm itself. This is where things like beauty and mercy, wisdom, grace, law, justice, meaning, sameness, difference, all these things which Plato considers the ideal forms, the kind of building blocks of reality itself. This is what the Platonist is supposed to be contemplating. And so when Porphyry talks about the theoretical virtues, we have to look at it in the sense of what comes after the cathartic virtue. So this isn't something that just involves, things like the study of geometry and astronomy, mathematics, which were very popular as higher philosophic studies during their time. This is the next step. By theoretical virtues, we mean the next step after the cathartic virtues. So now that, to an extent, your sense of being, your sense of existence has been purified from grasping at physical existence, from associating yourself with physical existence through the performance of the cathartic virtues. Now the soul is able to properly contemplate its own realm. And this kind of begins to take us towards the process that Plato describes in the analogy of the charioteer, the myth of the charioteer, kind of trying to lift the head of the soul into the heavenly realms, into the celestial plane, to be able to properly observe the gods themselves. And to Plato, the gods, of course, were things like beauty and justice and wisdom and things of this sort. So having purified itself from its physical basis, the soul is now seen as free to properly contemplate its own realm, to contemplate the things that it's meant to contemplate the things that are good for it, and that elevate it from a more mortal nature into its proper immortal nature and immortal way of functioning and existing. From the theoretic virtues, then the soul moves in towards what's called the paradigmatic virtues. And this is kind of a difficult level of virtue to understand. The use of the word paradigmatica is very specific in Platonism. It doesn't just mean an archetype. It's the word that Plato uses in the Timaeus to describe the higher reality, the noetic reality upon which this entire cosmos was made. And so, in that sense, the Demiurge in the Timaeus is engaged in this paradigmatic activity of creating the cosmos by constantly gazing upon and surveying and embodying within itself the entire noetic realm. And so likewise, when Porphyry has this idea of a paradigmatic being, a paradigmatic philosopher, he undoubtedly means something that to him is the very height of human capability. So he would have considered somebody like Plotinus or somebody like Plato to have been examples of paradigmatic beings, that their souls had become united with the same paradigm that the Demiurge's soul was united with when it was creating the cosmos through the perspective of the mythology of the Timaeus. And so a paradigmatic philosopher isn't just somebody who is contemplating beauty, somebody who is contemplating wisdom and justice and equality and sameness, but rather this is somebody who embodies these traits, which he undoubtedly considered his master Plotinus to be such an example. And this is where the classic kind of list of virtues up to Porphyry ends. And from this point, from Porphyry onwards, then we begin to move towards the Iamblichus and look at the hieratic virtues themselves. While Porphyry undoubtedly would have seen this as the end, right, the final perfection, soon after him, we get the master Iamblichus coming along, and he adds one more level to this. So Iamblichus was from northern Syria, from Chalcis, and he brought with him a lot of like Syrian and Persian magic into the Platonic tradition. He becomes a very pivotal figure in Platonic history in terms of how all the teachings after Iamblichus, all the great famous Platonic masters after Iamblichus were all incredibly influenced by Iamblichus. And so he's one of the more influential people to have lived in the Platonic tradition. So he adds to this set of 6 virtues a 7th called the hieratic or the Theurgic Virtues. And this is almost like a tantric or esoteric addition to the classic Platonic view of virtue, where from Iamblichus's perspective, without the actual mystery rites themselves, without the practices and teachings and methods of the mystery schools, you were not able to achieve the perfection of the soul that Plato speaks about, for example, in the Theaetetus. You're not able to achieve that perfection with just purely philosophic means. You had to kind of go beyond what the rational self could experience to experience something super rational, something that was beyond the normal rational mind. And this was Iamblichus's criticism of limiting the virtues to these first 6 levels, is because it limits human perfection to rational thought. And Iamblichus, coming from a very mystical place, from a place that in northern Syria, recently conquered by the Roman Empire, so it still contained a lot of its old original hieratic practices, mystery schools, esoteric methods. And so he had this understanding of that there were aspects to the human condition that were beyond what was normally rational, that the human soul had elements in it that were supra-rational, that transcended completely anything we could think about or understand rationally and intellectually. So he crowns these 6 other levels of perfection, these 6 other levels of virtuous cultivation, with the 7th one of Theurgic Virtue. And again, this is very similar to like tantric commitments, tantric virtues that we see in Buddhism and that we see in the Indian tantric traditions, such as the Siddha traditions or the Kola traditions, where there's all of a sudden life takes on a very esoteric dimension. So you've been working on yourself for years and years. You've been refining yourself, cultivating your mind, cultivating your self-control, becoming a virtuous being. And then you kind of have to take this step out of the rational world, a world that's nice and ordered and symmetrical and follows basic principles and rules and axioms. And you have to take a step out of this world now into the kind of the void. Right, into something that's unknown to you. You have to move from the known into the unknown. And this final leap is done, according to Iamblichus, through methods and rites and practices that invoke the unknown, right? That are meant to kind of almost paralyze your rational faculties through states of ecstasy and through deep and profound spiritual experiences. They're meant to override your normal rational way of experiencing life and lead you into a deeper, more spiritual state. And so for Iamblichus, this was the apoptic vision. This is your actual meeting face-to-face with the divine. And this could only be accomplished through the theurgic rites, according to Iamblichus. And some of the later philosophers after Iamblichus, I think, disputed a little bit as to whether this could be achieved through purely mystical means, such as Plotinus teaches, or if you really did need these mystery rites. But this was a profound change in the usual flow of Platonic teachings, and it had a huge impact. By the time Damascius, I think about 100, 150 years later, by the time Damascius arrives in Athens to the academy there, and he's with Isidorus, his teacher, he says they weren't even studying the dialogues anymore. He said it was basically a mystery school. Everybody was doing Iamblichus's theurgy, doing his hieratic practices. And they had to reintroduce philosophic contemplation because the esoteric methods were giving such profound results and people were really taking to them in a strong way. So this is this 7 levels of virtue in the later Platonic tradition. And I wanted to just look at this today because next time we do a video, we're going to be looking at crazy wisdom. And crazy wisdom is somewhat the antithesis of a more classic view like we have here in Platonism. And the middle line between classic Platonic virtue and kind of crazy wisdom, ecstatic, inconceivable virtue is the 7th level of virtue that Iamblichus has added here of Theurgic virtue, where the tantric methods and paths are often kind of the middle ground between the rational, known world and the kind of super-rational, ecstatic, unknowable world. And the tantric practices and methods lay often kind of in the middle of that. And by tantra here, I don't mean sex or anything like that. I mean, that can play a role in it. But tantric means, more esoteric and magical in how it relates to the world. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please make sure to like and to subscribe to the channel. I should be much more active again now, getting into the flow of things with the videos. And I'm looking forward to kind of comparing and contrasting this week's teachings with the next video we do on some more taboo and extreme spiritual practices and activities and behavior. So thank you all very much and hope you enjoyed.